The Sicilian sun of 1947 was a pale, tired imitation of the fierce god I had known in my youth. It didn't beat down anymore. It simply lay heavily upon the world, a thick woolen blanket of heat that smothered the hills and settled deep into the bones of the old city. My bar, if one could grace it with such a generous title, was a cave hewn from this lethargy. It had no name painted on its flaking stucco facade, and those who needed to find it already knew its location, tucked away like a shameful family secret in a narrow vicolo that the post-war rebuilding efforts had seemingly forgotten. Inside, the air was a stale soup of scents, the sharp, sweet tang of anise from unfinished glasses of pastis, the sour ghost of spilled wine that no amount of mopping could ever truly erase, and the ever-present dust, motes of which danced in the few, slanted pillars of light that dared to penetrate the gloom from the high, barred windows. It was a place for men to wait, not to live, to sit with their thoughts and their regrets until the shadows grew long and swallowed them whole for another day. I was one of those men. My name is of little consequence. It has been many years since it held any weight. Now, I am just the old man who minds the bar, who pours the drinks and listens to the silence more often than to the confessions of the few broken souls who still wander in. They see the bottles lined up behind me, their amber and green contents catching the dim light, but they don't truly see me. Not until their eyes, adjusted to the murk, travel downwards and catch the mark. It is not a gentle line, not something earned in a fall as a boy or in some honest trade. No, this scar is a violation, a brutal, pearlescent seam of tissue that runs from the crest of my left cheekbone, down across the flesh, to end just shy of the corner of my mouth. It pulls the skin taut, giving my face a perpetual, slight sneer that I did not choose. When the weather is damp, or when a certain kind of memory stirs in the forgotten corners of my mind, it aches with a deep, cold throb, a phantom pain from a world that no longer exists. A young man, one of the new breed with loud shirts and ideas blown in from the north, came in once. He was lost, he said. He looked at my face with a kind of horrified fascination, not with the fear or the respect it once commanded, but with the clinical curiosity of a tourist looking at some ancient, crumbling monument. No, he asked, his voice too loud for the sacred quiet of the place. How did you get that? He thought it was a war wound, perhaps from the African campaign or the resistance. He could not conceive of a war that was never declared, that was fought not in trenches or piazzas, but in silent courtyards and smoke-filled rooms, a war where the uniforms were finely tailored suits and the weapons were a word, a look, a calculated silence. I did not answer him with words. I simply turned and poured him a glass of the local red, sliding it across the warped wood of the counter. The gesture was a dismissal, a closing of a door he never even knew was there. You cannot explain the scent of orange blossoms in a grove at midnight to a man who has only ever smelled motor oil. You cannot describe the crushing, sacred weight of a Bacio Solimano, the kiss of respect given to a Don, to one who believes respect is something shouted in a crowd. And you simply cannot, articulate how this scar came to be. It is not a story you tell, it is a story you have lived, and the living of it takes everything from you, leaving only the ghost and the mark as proof that you were ever there at all. So I sit here, in this cathedral of dust and forgotten things. The fly buzzing lazily near the bottle of Amaro is my choir. The slow, rhythmic drip of the leaky tap behind the counter is my clock. And this scar, this ugly, beautiful, terrible scar, is my gospel. It is the first page of a book written in blood and bound in human leather, and every throb, every twinge, is the turning of a page. To understand it, you must not look at me, the old man in the bar. You must look past the wrinkles, past the tired eyes, and see the boy I was. You must see the Sicily of 1922, a land burning under a different, more vital sun, a land where I was not a relic, but a swift and silent shadow running errands for men who moved mountains with a whisper. You must see the world before the great silence fell, the world that made me, the world that marked me, and the world that I, in my small, fatal way, helped to end. This bar, this present, is just the echo. The scar is the sound. And it is a story that begins not with a bang, but with the careful, deliberate closing of a door. To understand the boy I was, you must first bleach the color from this world you know. You must peel back the layers of time, of war, of the great forgetting, until you find the Sicily of 1922. It was a land of brutal, beautiful contrasts, a canvas painted in the ochre of dust, the deep green of the lemon groves at dusk, and the startling, bloody crimson of the bougainvillea that tumbled over whitewashed walls. The sun was not the tired, pallid orb it is today. It was a furious, brass hammer that beat the land into submission from dawn until long after the shadows had stretched like lazy cats across the cobblestones. The air itself was thick, heavy with the scent of baking earth, of jasmine from hidden courtyards, and the salty, profound breath of the sea that surrounded us, a constant, shimmering presence at the edge of everything. We were an island, yes, but we were a world unto ourselves, governed by rhythms and rules that had been old when the Normans first landed on our shores. I was a sparrow in that world. A small, thin thing, all sharp angles and watchful eyes, dressed in hand-me-down trousers that were too short and a shirt that had been washed so many times it was the color of the sky on a hazy day. My name was Rico then, though it was rarely used. I was more often summoned by a sharp hiss of breath, a snap of fingers, or simply by the weight of a man's gaze settling upon me. I had no father to speak of. He had sailed for America when I was still in swaddling clothes, a ghost who sent occasional, crumpled dollar bills that smelled of a different, distant sweat. My mother, a seamstress whose eyes were always red from strain and whose hands were perpetually pricked by needles, viewed me with a kind of weary exasperation. I was another mouth to feed, a boy too restless for the church and too clever for the fields. So I took to the streets. The labyrinthine alleys of our quarter were my true home, my kingdom. I knew every crack in the plaster, every hidden passageway between buildings, every courtyard where the washing hung like colorful, silent flags. And it was in these streets that I first learned the true geography of power. It was not mapped in the grand municipal buildings or the carabinieri barracks. It was written in the subtle, unspoken language of the men who moved through our world not as part of it, but as its masters. They were not like the other men, the laborers with their stooped shoulders and calloused hands, the shopkeepers with their loud, bargaining voices. These men were quiet. Their power was not shouted, it was whispered. It was in the cut of their linen suits, immaculate even in the punishing heat. It was in the slow, deliberate way they walked, a pace that forced the world to move around them. It was in their eyes, which held a flat, dark calm, like the surface of the sea just before a storm. They were the men of respect. And the most formidable of them all was Don Lucio. His name was rarely spoken above a murmur. He was not a large man, not physically. He was of average height, with a carefully trimmed gray mustache and hands that were always clean, the nails perfectly shaped. But his presence could fill a piazza. It was an aura of absolute, unassailable authority that seemed to still the very air around him. When he passed, the boisterous arguments in the market would falter, the old women fanning themselves on their stoops would fall silent, and the children would stop their games. It was as if life itself held its breath until he had moved on. I first came to his notice not through any act of bravery, but through an act of observation. I was perched on a low wall, sucking on a piece of sour lemon, watching the world go by. I saw two of his men, Franco and Enzo, having a quiet, but intensely animated, discussion near the fountain. Their backs were to the street. I saw a young, reckless man from a rival clan, a pup trying to make a name for himself, creep up behind them, a knife glinting in his hand. I did not shout. I did not run. I was a sparrow, remember? I simply took the lemon peel from my mouth, aimed, and threw it. It was a perfect, stupid, miraculous shot. The wet, pithy bit of rind hit the back of the knife-wielder's neck with a soft, wet slap. He flinched, startled, and turned. That half-second of confusion was all Enzo needed. He spun around, his own blade appearing in his hand as if by magic, and the situation was resolved before it had even truly begun. The would-be assailant scurried away, his tail between his legs. Enzo looked around, his eyes scanning the street, and they landed on me. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just looked at me for a long, hard moment, his gaze taking in my small, still form on the wall. Then he turned and walked away. The next day, as I was scrounging for fallen figs, a shadow fell over me. It was Franco. He dropped a single silver lira into the dust at my feet. "The Don thanks you for your sharp eyes," he grunted, and then he was gone. That single coin, more money than I had ever held, was my passport. I was no longer just a street sparrow. I was a boy who had been noticed. Slowly, cautiously, I was drawn into the periphery of their world. My first tasks were simple, childish things. "Rico, run to the tabacallo and fetch Don Lucio's cigars. Do not stop. Do not speak to anyone. Rico, wait outside the cafe and tell me if the man with the green hat arrives. Rico, carry this basket of bread to the widow Caruso." The tasks were mundane, but the instructions were always layered with unspoken meaning. The cigars were a test of my speed and discretion. The man with the green hat was a test of my observation. The bread for the widow, whose son had disappeared after crossing Don Lucio, was a lesson in the economy of fear and favor. The system, in its most basic form. I was a quick study. I learned to move through the streets like a ghost, my bare feet making no sound on the hot stones. I learned to listen not just to words, but to the silences between them. I learned that in this world, a boy who knew how to be silent, how to watch, and how to be forgotten, was more valuable than a man with a loud voice and a strong fist. I was living in the shadows of giants, and with every passing day, I was learning to love the cool, dark safety they provided. The summons, when it finally came, was not a shouted command or a formal invitation. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, a change in the current of the life I had become a part of. It was a Tuesday, I remember, the air so still and hot that the very sounds of the city seemed muted, absorbed by the oppressive blanket of the sirocco wind that had blown in from Africa. I was idling by the port, watching the fishing boats rock on the oily, listless water, their bright paint looking faded under the hazy sun. Franco found me there. He did not call my name. He simply materialized beside me, his large frame blocking the view of the sea. He smelled of tobacco and clean, starched linen, a scent that was already becoming synonymous with authority in my mind. "The Don has a task for you," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of any discernible emotion. He did not look at me, but kept his eyes on the horizon, as if scanning for some unseen threat. My heart, which had been beating a lazy, summer rhythm, suddenly hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was different from fetching cigars or watching for a man in a green hat. This was a direct task from Don Lucio himself. Franco's hand moved, slow and deliberate, into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced not a weapon, but a simple, cream-colored envelope. It was thick, expensive paper, sealed with a blot of dark red wax. There was no name or address on it. "You will take this," Franco instructed, his eyes finally dropping to meet mine. The weight of his gaze was physical. "You will go to the church of San Giuseppe. You will walk at a normal pace. You will not run. You will go to the third confessional on the left. You will slide this under the curtain. You will not look inside. You will not speak. You will wait for a count of 10. If nothing happens, you will leave. You will return here by the same route. You will speak to no one. If anyone stops you, you know nothing. You are a boy running an errand for your mother. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat suddenly too dry for speech. The instructions were simple, yet they coiled in my gut like a serpent. Every clause was a potential trap, a test of my nerve and my obedience. The envelope felt heavy in my small hand, Impossibly so. It was just paper and wax, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled my blood despite the heat, that it contained words that could end lives, forge alliances, or declare wars. I was no longer just a messenger. I was a vessel for a secret, and the weight of that secret was immense. "Go," Franco said, and with that single, soft word I was launched. The walk to the church of San Giuseppe was the longest journey of my young life. The familiar streets of my quarter seemed alien, fraught with new and hidden dangers. Every shadow in a doorway seemed to hold a watching eye. Every casual glance from a passerby felt like an interrogation. The envelope was a brand in my hand, a glowing coal that I was certain announced my purpose to the entire world. I clutched it tightly, my palms sweating, fearing I would drop it, yet also wanting to hide it away in my pocket, though I knew that would be a breach of my orders. I walked at the prescribed, normal pace, a pace that felt like a funeral march. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in my ears, a frantic counter-rhythm to the calm, steady beat I was forcing my legs to maintain. I passed the baker, whose warm, yeasty scent usually made my mouth water. Today, it smelled like nothing. I passed the old men playing scopa outside the cafe. Their laughter sounded like a threat. I was alone in a crowd, an island of terrifying purpose in a sea of oblivious life. The cool, dim silence of the church was a shock to my system. After the blinding white heat of the piazza, the interior felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of old incense, polished wood, and damp stone. A few old women, shrouded in black, knelt in the pews, their rosaries clicking like the mandibles of insects. My footsteps on the marble floor echoed unnaturally loud in the sacred hush. My eyes adjusted to the gloom, finding the row of dark wooden confessionals lining the north wall. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The third on the left. I walked towards it, each step an eternity. The confessional seemed to grow larger as I approached, a monolithic, judging presence. I could see the faint outline of a shoe beneath the curtain of the priest's side. Someone was in there, listening, waiting. I stopped before the penitent's side, the third on the left. I did not look inside. I did not speak. Following my orders with the rigid precision of a soldier, I bent down and, with a hand that trembled only slightly, I slid the thick, cream-colored envelope under the heavy velvet curtain. I heard the soft whisper of paper on stone as it disappeared from view. Then silence. I straightened up, my breath caught in my throat. I began to count in my head. The numbers were jumbled, chaotic. I forced them into order, focusing on the slow, steady rhythm. Set, nov. On Daisai, I turned. I did not look back. I walked away, my pace still measured, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to flee this place of shadows and secrets. I did not breathe properly until I was back outside, squinting in the harsh sunlight of the piazza. The return journey was a blur. The weight was gone from my hand, but it had settled deep inside me, a cold, hard stone of knowledge. I had done it. I had been a ghost. A vessel. When I finally reached the port, Franco was still there, leaning against the same wall, as if he had not moved a muscle. He saw me approach, and his eyes, those flat, dark pools, scanned me from head to toe, looking for any sign of panic, any tear in the fabric of my composure. I stopped before him, saying nothing. After a long moment, he gave a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a smile. It was not praise. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation. In the economy of that world, that nod was a fortune. It was a silent currency of trust, more valuable than any silver lira, and I knew in that moment that my life had irrevocably changed. I was no longer just a boy in the shadows. I was now, for better or for worse, a part of them. The single, silent nod from Franco was a key, and it unlocked a door to a world I had only ever glimpsed from the outside, a world that existed in the negative spaces of the bright, noisy Sicilian day. I was no longer just an errand boy, a sparrow to be sent on fleeting missions. I had been granted a provisional membership to a secret society, the initiation for which was not a spoken oath, but a demonstrated capacity for silence and a stomach for the unspoken. My duties shifted, evolved. I was still a runner, a fetcher, a pair of watchful eyes, but the context changed, deepening in their intimacy and their implicit danger. I was now allowed to wait, not just outside a cafe, but inside the back room of the cafe, standing motionless in the corner like a piece of furniture, ready to refill a glass of amber-colored Amaro or to accept a heavy, fur-lined coat when the weather, impossibly, turned cool. It was in these smoky back rooms that my real education began. The locations changed. A private room at the back of a trattoria where the air was thick with the smell of garlic and roasting meat, a musty storeroom behind a tailor's shop filled with bolts of fine English wool, Don Lucio's own study in his modest-looking but impeccably guarded villa on the outskirts of the city. But the atmosphere was always the same. It was a world of men, a world from which all frivolity and unnecessary noise had been bled out. The air was a permanent, blue-gray haze, the smoke from Toscano cigars and Nazionale cigarettes coiling in the lamplight like lazy serpents. The conversations were not conversations as the outside world knew them. They were exchanges of code, of implication, of things said by not being said. I learned the language of this world. A man asking after another man's health was never just a question of medicine. It was a query about his stability, his loyalty, his vulnerability. A discussion about the poor quality of the olive harvest in a certain valley was a negotiation over territory and the tributes owed from the presses in that area. A compliment paid to a man's son was a veiled threat, a reminder of the fragility of legacy. I learned to read the subtle choreography of power. The way Don Lucio would listen, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled, while a supplicant or a subordinate laid out a problem. He would let the silence stretch, let it become uncomfortable, let the man sweat in the space between his own words. The silence was a tool, a weapon. It forced a man to reconsider his position, to offer more, to reveal a weakness he had intended to conceal. A quick answer was a sign of a simple mind. A considered silence was the mark of a man who understood the weight of consequences. I learned the hierarchy, not from any chart or list, but from the subtle, unspoken signals that passed between the men. The order in which they entered a room. The specific chair each man was expected to take. The way Enzo, whose violence was a quiet, contained thing, held himself with a different authority than Franco, whose strength was more overt. There was old man Lombardo, who never raised his voice, but whose counsel on financial matters was treated with the reverence of a papal decree. There was the young, fiery Santoro, who was all ambition and flash, but who was careful to temper his enthusiasm in Don Lucio's presence. I was a ghost in the machine, watching the gears and cogs of this intricate clockwork of power turn. I saw money change hands, but never crudely, never in a way that could be mistaken for a simple payment. It was always folded discreetly into a newspaper, slipped inside a box of pastries, pressed between two palms in a handshake that lasted a moment too long. It was the lifeblood of the sistema, and its flow was governed by rituals as strict and complex as any high mass. And through it all, there was the omnipresent, unshakable doctrine, La Famiglia. The family. It was a word that meant everything and nothing. It did not just mean the blood relatives, the wife, the children, the cousins. It meant the organization. It was a sacred entity, a concept more powerful than the church, more demanding than the state. Your loyalty to the family was the paramount concern of your existence. It superseded personal desire, moral qualm, even the instinct for self-preservation. To betray the family was the one unforgivable sin, a transgression for which there was no penance, only penalty. I saw men, hardened men who would knife a rival in a dark alley without a second thought, speak of the family with a tone of reverence that bordered on the mystical. It was the source of all honor, all protection, all meaning. In return for your absolute loyalty, The family offered you an identity, a purpose, and a place in a world that was otherwise chaotic and cruel. It was a fortress, and the walls of that fortress were built not of stone, but of silence and blood. I, the quiet boy in the corner, was being offered a space within those walls. I was being taught the rules of this new, intoxicating world, a world where a nod from a man like Franco could make you feel 10 feet tall, and where the quiet hum of power in a smoke-filled room was a more potent drug than any wine. I was learning to be a man, or at least, the kind of man who survived in the shadows cast by Don Lucio. And I was a willing, eager student, drinking in the poison nectar of this dark education, unaware that the first true test of my loyalty would not come from a task of delivery, but from the careless shape of a single, whispered word overheard in the bustling, sun-drenched chaos of the marketplace. The world within the smoke-filled rooms was a world of controlled pressure, a carefully maintained equilibrium where every word was weighed and every gesture calibrated. It existed in a vacuum of its own making, insulated from the chaotic, vibrant life of the city. But my duties still required me to move between these two worlds, to step from the sacred, silent hush of Don Lucio's study back out into the teeming, noisy reality of the Palermo markets. It was a jarring transition every time. To go from a place where a raised eyebrow could signal a death sentence, to a place where fishwives shrieked and donkeys brayed and the air was a thick stew of smells, rotting vegetables, salt from the sea, frying pan oil, and the pungent, unmistakable odor of humanity packed tightly together. I was a conduit, and I prided myself on my ability to shift between these two states of being, to wear the mask of the simple, harmless street urchin even as the secrets of powerful men simmered inside my skull. It was on one such errand, a simple task to procure a specific type of olive oil that Don Lucio favored for his table, that the two worlds collided with a force that left me breathless. The Mercato di Bellaro was at its zenith of chaos. The awnings of the stalls created a patchwork of shade and blistering sun, and the crowd moved in a slow, viscous current, a river of bodies and bargaining. I was navigating the edges, my mind partly on the list in my head, partly on the memory of a conversation I had overheard the night before about a shipment of American cigarettes being delayed. I was so immersed in this internal world that I almost didn't register the two men leaning against a wall in a sliver of shade between a cheese vendor and a man selling live chickens. Almost. They were not from our quarter. Their dress was slightly flashier, their postures more relaxed, almost arrogant. One of them I recognized. Vito, a young, swaggering upstart from the emerging clan of the Corso dei Mille, a group whose ambition was starting to grate against the established order of Don Lucio's quiet dominion. They thought they were hidden, shielded by the market's din. They were wrong. The river of the crowd parted for a moment, and a pocket of strange acoustics formed, carrying their voices to me as clearly as if they were standing at my elbow. Vito was laughing, a sharp, ugly sound. Like taking candy from a baby, he was saying, his voice dripping with contempt. The old man's men are asleep at the wheel. They guard the front door while we slip in through the window. He took a drag from his cigarette. 3 crates of Scottish whiskey. Top shelf. They never even knew they had it. It's already sold, the money is already in my pocket. He tapped his chest, a gesture of profound smugness. His companion, a heavier man with a pockmarked face, chuckled, a low, guttural sound. Don Lucio is getting soft, the heavy man grunted. His time is passing. He should make room for new blood. The words hit me with the physical force of a blow. The air was driven from my lungs. The noise of the market, the shouting, the clatter, the squawking chickens, faded into a dull, roaring hum in my ears. All that existed were Vito's words, echoing in the suddenly hollow space inside my head. 3 crates of Scottish whiskey. I knew instantly which shipment he was talking about. It had been a point of discussion, a valuable consignment secured through a new contact in Messina. Its disappearance had been a quiet, contained mystery, a source of grim speculation in the back room just 2 nights prior. Enzo had suspected a rival port authority official. Franco had muttered about greedy sailors. No one had suspected the upstarts from the Corso. It was an act of breathtaking audacity. But more than the theft itself, it was the boasting. The careless, reckless, stupid boasting. In our world, such a successful operation would have been a secret held tighter than a man holds his own soul. It would have been buried deep, never spoken of, its success its own silent reward. To speak of it was insanity. To boast of it in a public market was a sacrilege, a spit in the face of the very concept of Omertà. A coldness seeped through me, a chill that had nothing to do with the shade and everything to do with the terrible weight of the knowledge I now carried. I stood frozen, a statue in the stream of moving bodies. The olive oil was forgotten. My task was gone from my mind. I was now the sole repository of a truth that had the power to unleash a storm. I knew what I had to do. There was no question, no moment of moral deliberation. The doctrine was too deeply ingrained already. You hear something, you report it. Loyalty to the family was absolute. This was not a choice. It was a biological imperative, like breathing. Yet, as I turned and began to weave my way back through the crowd, my pace no longer that of a careless boy but of a soul fleeing a burning building, the weight of it settled upon my young shoulders. This was different from delivering an envelope. That had been a test of my nerve. This was a test of my soul. I was not carrying a secret, I was carrying a death sentence. I knew, with a certainty that turned my stomach to ice, what would happen to Vito and his pockmarked friend. Don Lucio could not, and would not, let such an insult stand. The theft was a problem. The boasting was a declaration of war. And I, a boy of 13, was the one delivering the declaration. The walk back to the small, nondescript office Don Lucio used near the docks was a waking nightmare. The bright, cheerful sun felt like an accusation. The cheerful calls of the vendors sounded like mockery. Every face I saw seemed to know my terrible secret. I saw Vito's face in my mind, his smug, laughing face, and I knew I was erasing it from the world. I was not just a messenger anymore. I was the finger on the trigger, the hand holding the knife. The cold stone of knowledge that had settled inside me after the church errand now felt like a shard of ice, piercing me from the inside out. I was doing my duty, I was being a good soldier for the family, but for the first time, I felt the true, monstrous cost of the silence I had so eagerly learned to worship. I was about to trade a man's life for a whisper. The journey back to the small, whitewashed building near the docks, the place that served as the nerve center of Don Lucio's operations, was a pilgrimage through a landscape of dread. The vibrant, chaotic life of the market felt like a dream from which I had been violently awakened, and the world I was returning to was a stark, monochrome reality of consequence. My feet, usually so sure and silent on the cobblestones, felt like blocks of lead, each step a conscious, laborious effort that carried me closer to a precipice. The sun, which had felt so accusing moments before, now seemed to have withdrawn its warmth, casting a flat, indifferent light on the city. The sounds of Palermo, the distant clang of a church bell, the cry of a gulls, the rhythmic clip-clop of a horse-drawn cart, all seemed to have been stripped of their meaning, reduced to a dull, funereal soundtrack for the errand I was now upon. I was no longer Rico, the quick-footed errand boy. I was a vessel of fate, and the knowledge I carried was a poison that was already beginning to work its way through my system. I found Don Lucio not in the main room, but in the small, Spartan office at the back, the one with a single window that looked out onto the shimmering, merciless blue of the sea. He was alone, seated behind a large, scarred wooden desk, studying a ledger through a pair of small, wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked more like a weary accountant than a kingpin. Franco stood by the door, a silent, mountainous sentinel. He saw my face as I entered, and his own expression did not change, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight straightening of the spine, a readiness. I stopped a few feet from the desk, my hands clenched at my sides, my heart hammering so violently I was certain they could hear it in the quiet room. Don Lucio did not look up immediately. He finished a line in his ledger, made a small, precise notation with his fountain pen, and then slowly, deliberately, he set the pen down. He removed his spectacles and looked at me. His eyes, those famous, calm pools, held no anger, no impatience. They were simply waiting. "Rico," he said, his voice soft, neutral. "You have returned early. The oil?" I shook my head, my throat constricted. I tried to speak, but the words were stuck, lodged behind the terrifying image of Vito's laughing face. I swallowed, a dry, painful click. "I was at the Bellaro, Don Lucio," I managed to force out, my voice a thin, reedy thing. I heard men talking. I recounted it all, my words spilling out in a rushed, trembling torrent. I named Vito. I described his companion. I repeated their words with a horrifying, photographic accuracy, the boast about the whiskey, the contempt for the old man, the declaration that his time was passing. As I spoke, I watched Don Lucio's face. It remained a mask of calm, but I saw the tiny tells. A slight tightening at the corners of his mouth. A minute flaring of his nostrils. The stillness that settled over him was not one of peace, but of a predator absorbing the scent of its prey. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute, heavier and more profound than any I had ever experienced. It was a silence that absorbed sound, that absorbed light, that absorbed hope. Franco, by the door, had not moved a muscle, but his presence seemed to have expanded, filling the corners of the room with a promise of violence. Don Lucio leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking softly. He steepled his fingers, his gaze drifting from me to the window, to the vast, untroubled sea. He seemed to be considering a complex mathematical equation. "The whiskey," he said almost to himself. "A small thing. A business loss. It is the cost of doing business." He brought his eyes back to me, and they were different now. They were no longer pools, but chips of flint. "But the tongue is not a small thing. A loose tongue is a crack in the foundation. A single crack, if left untended, can bring down the entire house." He paused, letting the metaphor hang in the stifling air. "We live in the shadows, Rico. Our strength is our silence. It is the wall that protects us from the world, and the world from us. When a man breaks that silence, he does not just steal from me. He spits on the graves of his fathers. He endangers every man, every woman, every child who lives within the protection of our family. He tells the world that our walls are weak." He stood up then, slowly, and came around the desk. He was not a tall man, but in that moment he seemed to tower over me. He placed a hand on my shoulder. It was not a comforting gesture. It was the weight of a benediction and a curse. "You have done well, boy," he said, his voice low and grave. "You have shown loyalty. You have shown you understand that the family is everything. What you have brought me today is not just information. It is a lesson. And a lesson, to be remembered, must be written in a language that all men can understand." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The meaning was as clear as the summer sky outside the window. The lesson would be written in blood. The cold shard of ice inside me twisted, and I understood with a final, devastating clarity that I was not just the messenger. I was a part of the lesson itself. I had provided the text. My loyalty was the ink, and Vito's fate would be the parchment. Don Lucio gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Franco, who, without a word, turned and left the room. His footsteps echoed down the hall, each one a beat in the drum roll of a coming execution. I stood there, under the weight of the Don's hand, and I felt the last vestiges of my childhood innocence slew away, leaving behind something harder, colder, and infinitely more ancient. I had learned the price of a whisper, and the cost was a man's life and a piece of my own soul. The lesson, as Don Lucio had promised, was delivered in a language all could understand. It was not a public spectacle, that was the way of barbarians and the state. This was a private performance for a select audience. Vito's body was found 2 days later in a narrow irrigation canal on the outskirts of the city, the water around him stained a rusty brown. The official story, the one that would be whispered in the markets and recorded in the police ledger, was a robbery, a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the real story, the one that mattered, was written on the body itself. The message was not in the fact of his death, but in the specific, terrible artistry of its execution. It was a message that said, "We know. We are watching. Your silence is your life." The market, for a day or two, was quieter than usual. The boasting stopped. The equilibrium, for a time, was restored. But the peace was a fragile one, bought with a brutality that had left its mark not just on Vito, but on me. I saw his face in my dreams, but it was no longer laughing. It was accusatory, its silence a louder condemnation than his boasts had ever been. The men from the Corso, however, were not so easily cowed. Humiliated and enraged by the very public nature of their subordinates' punishment, for though the public did not see the body, our world knew every grisly detail, they began to push back. It started with small things, petty provocations. A vendor who paid his pizzo, his protection money, to our organization would find his stall vandalized. One of our men would be jumped by 3 of theirs in an alley, given a beating meant to bruise pride more than bone. It was a deliberate campaign of pinpricks, testing the seams of Don Lucio's authority, seeing if the old lion still had teeth. The atmosphere in the back rooms grew tense, the smoke a little thicker, the silences more charged. The easy confidence was replaced by a watchful, coiled energy. Franco and Enzo were like hounds on a leash, their quiet violence simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the command to be unleashed. The command, when it came, was not a shouted order, but a quiet decision made in Don Lucio's study after a meeting with the insulted vendor, an old man who had been with the family since my father was a boy. "Enough," was all the Don had said, and the single word had the finality of a slamming door. The response would be decisive. It would be an answer that would not merely punish, but would re-establish the natural order of things. A meeting was arranged, a parley in the neutral territory of a deserted warehouse near the old salt pans. The air there was thick with the smell of decay and the sea, a fitting backdrop for the discussion of endings. Don Lucio would go himself, taking only Franco and Enzo as his escort. It was a show of strength, of fearlessness. To take more men would be to show weakness. I was to go as well, not as a participant, but as an attendant, the boy who would hold the coats, who would stand by the door, a living symbol of the Don's normalcy, his unshakable routine, even in the face of conflict. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows, its high, vaulted ceiling lost in darkness, the only light filtering through grime-caked windows high on the walls, casting dusty, diagonal shafts onto the concrete floor. The air was cold and still, heavy with the ghosts of forgotten cargo. The men from the Corso were already there, 5 of them, led by a man named Morello, a bull-necked individual with small, suspicious eyes. They stood in a loose group, their postures aggressive, their hands never far from their sides. We stood opposite them. Don Lucio, a small, immaculate figure in the vast, dirty space. Franco and Enzo flanking him, 2 pillars of silent menace. And me, a few paces behind, trying to make myself invisible, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The discussion began, the words polite, formal, but layered with a venom that made the air hum. Don Lucio's voice was calm, reasonable. Morello's was a guttural growl, all bluster and implied threat. They spoke of respect, of territory, of the old ways. I watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the dance of power unfolded. It was a ballet of tension, each word a carefully placed step on a tightrope stretched over an abyss. I was so focused on the exchange, on the subtle shifts in posture, the flickers of anger in Morello's eyes, that I failed to notice the shadow that detached itself from a pile of rotting crates to our left. It was a 6th man, one they had hidden, a final, desperate card to play. The world exploded into motion and sound. A gunshot rang out, shockingly loud in the cavernous space, the report echoing off the walls like a peal of damned thunder. It was not aimed at Don Lucio. That would have been an act of war from which there could be no return. It was aimed at Enzo, the more dangerous of the 2 bodyguards. I saw Enzo grunt and spin, clutching his arm. In the split second of shock that followed the gunshot, the hidden man lunged forward, not with a gun, but with a lipera, a traditional Sicilian shotgun, sawed off and brutal. He didn't raise it to fire, he swung it like a club, its heavy, metal-bound stock aimed directly at Don Lucio's head. It was a killing blow. I did not think. There was no time for thought. There was only instinct, an impulse written into my very bones by months of silent observation, of absorbed loyalty, of living and breathing the doctrine of the family. I moved. I threw myself forward, a small, insignificant projectile launched into the path of destiny. I collided with the Don, shoving him sideways with all my meager strength. It was just enough. The swinging stock of the lupra missed his skull by inches. But my momentum, my desperate lunge, had put me directly in its path. I saw a flash of stained wood and polished steel, and then there was no sight, only sensation. A white-hot, searing line of agony was drawn across my face. It was not a blunt impact, it was a precise, tearing slice. The world dissolved into a cacophony of screams and more gunfire. I felt a warm, wet flood pour down my cheek, my neck, soaking into my shirt. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I stumbled, fell to my knees on the cold, gritty concrete, my hands flying to my face, coming away slick and red. The pain was immense, a sun-going supernova in the left side of my head. Through a blur of tears and blood, I saw Franco, a giant unleashed, his own knife now in his hand, dealing with the man with the lupra in a manner that was both swift and eternally lasting. The rest of the Corso men, seeing their gambit had failed, were scrambling, fleeing into the deeper shadows of the warehouse. Then Don Lucio was there, kneeling beside me. His composure was finally, truly broken. His eyes, those pools of eternal calm, were wide with a shock that bordered on awe. He tore his own immaculate, silk pocket square from his jacket and pressed it hard against the side of my face. "Hold it, Rico," he commanded, his voice sharp, urgent. "Hold it tight." The white silk turned crimson instantly. He looked from my bloody face to my eyes, and in his gaze, I saw something new, something I had never seen directed at me before, a profound, absolute respect. The pain was excruciating, a fire that threatened to consume me, but somewhere, deep beneath the shock and the agony, a cold, hard kernel of understanding formed. This scar, this terrible, searing wound, was not a mark of shame. It was a badge of honor. It was the ultimate argument, the final, unanswerable proof of my loyalty, written not in ink or whisper, but in my own flesh and blood. I had paid the price, and I had purchased my place in the family forever. The world, for a long time after the warehouse, was a thing of muffled sounds and blurred edges, viewed through a haze of pain and the potent, bitter-smelling poultices applied by the old woman Don Lucio employed for such discreet medical needs. The wound on my face was a raw, fiery continent of agony, its geography mapped by stitches that pulled my skin taut with every twitch, every heartbeat. I was installed not in my mother's humble dwelling, but in a small, clean room at the back of Don Lucio's own villa, a place of cool, whitewashed walls and the scent of lemon polish. My mother was told I had taken a job as a live-in helper for a wealthy family, a story she accepted with a weary, hopeful sigh, grateful for one less mouth to feed. She never knew the true price of my employment. In this quiet room, I was tended to, fed broths and wines that dulled the pain, and visited daily by the Don himself. He would sit in a simple chair by my bed, sometimes in silence, sometimes speaking in his low, measured tones of loyalty, of honor, of the debt that could never be repaid but would be honored for a lifetime. My scar, he told me, was my fidelta, my fidelity, made manifest. It was a mark that set me apart, that elevated me from a useful boy to a man of substance within the family. It was my shield and my title, all in one. As the fire in my face subsided to a persistent, throbbing ache and the stitches were removed, revealing the angry, purple seam that would forever be my new feature, I emerged back into the world, but a world that had subtly shifted. I was no longer Rico, the quiet shadow. I was Rico, the one who took the blow for the Don. Men who had previously looked through me now met my gaze, their nods containing a new weight of acknowledgement. Franco would clap a heavy hand on my good shoulder, a gesture that was as close to affection as he could muster. Enzo, his own arm in a sling, would give me a tight, grim smile of shared experience. I was given new responsibilities, no longer just fetching and carrying, but learning the ledgers, the complex, coded records of tribute and payment, of favors owed and debts collected. I was being groomed, taught the business of power from the inside. The world of the family had never felt more solid, more permanent, more right. The lesson of the warehouse and the scar it had bestowed upon me seemed to have cemented the natural order of things for a generation to come. But outside our carefully constructed fortress of silence and respect, a different kind of storm was gathering, one that did not play by our ancient, unwritten rules. The first whispers were easy to dismiss. Talk of a new man in Rome, a former journalist and socialist named Benito Mussolini, who spoke with a bluster and fury that made Morello from the Corso seem like a polite shopkeeper. He ranted about order, about discipline, about the glory of a new Roman Empire. We paid little heed. Politicians were transient, noisy creatures. They came and went, their laws and eddies glancing harmlessly off the granite walls of our sistema. They could be bought, or intimidated, or simply waited out. This, we thought, was no different. We were wrong. This was a different kind of fire. Mussolini's fascists were not interested in the delicate dance of bribery and coexistence. They saw our power not as a parallel force to be managed, but as a disease to be scorched from the body of the nation, a rival authority to be annihilated. The first sign of the new wind was the arrival of a new prefect of police, a man shipped in from the north with a hard face and eyes that held no price tag. The comfortable, long-standing arrangements with the local carabinieri captains were abruptly severed. Men we had owned for years suddenly could not meet our eyes in the street. Then came the raids. Not the careful, almost ceremonial arrests of the past, but violent, dawn-breaking invasions. Homes were kicked in, businesses torn apart, men dragged from their families in nightshirts, their cries echoing in the once sacrosanct quiet of the morning. The language of our power was being overwritten by a louder, cruder tongue. The subtle implication, the respectful silence, the economy of fear and favor, these were meaningless to the blackshirts who now swarmed the streets. Their authority came from the fist, the gun, and the sanction of the state. They did not fear our reputation, they sought to erase it. Don Lucio, for the first time in my memory, began to look his age. The calm in his eyes was replaced by a watchful, weary tension. The back rooms were no longer filled with the easy smoke of cigars, but with the frantic, hushed debates of men seeing the walls of their world cracking. Some argued for confrontation, for a war in the shadows to show these northern upstarts the price of Sicilian defiance. Others, more pragmatic, counseled retreat, a going to ground, a waiting for the storm to pass. Don Lucio listened to it all, his steepled fingers pressed to his lips, his gaze distant. He knew this was not a rival family to be outmaneuvered. This was the tide, and a man, even a man like him, cannot hold back the sea. The shadows that had once been our refuge were now illuminated by the harsh, clinical light of the state. The old rhythms were broken. The silent understanding that had governed our lives was shattered by the jackboots on the cobblestones. I watched as men I knew, men of respect and substance, were paraded in chains through the streets for the newspapers to photograph, their dignity stripped from them, their power rendered a public spectacle. The fortress of the family was under a siege more terrible than any we had ever imagined, not because the walls were being battered down, but because the very ground upon which it stood was being washed away. The scar on my face, once a badge of honor, began to feel like a target. The new silence that fell over Palermo was not our sacred, chosen silence of Omertà. It was the terrified, brittle silence of a population holding its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall, knowing that the old kings were being dethroned, and that the new ones ruled with a different, more impersonal kind of terror. The decline was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, inexorable leaching of color from our world, a draining of its vital essence. The fascist purge, which they grandly called the reclamation of Sicily, was a machine of terrifying efficiency, powered by an ideology that had no patience for our ancient, nuanced ways. One by one, the pillars of our world were chipped away, arrested on trumped-up charges or simply disappearing into the network of penal colonies on remote, wind-scoured islands. The back rooms grew emptier, the silences longer and more despairing. The smoke that lingered was now the smoke of anxiety, not contemplation. Franco was taken in a violent scuffle outside his mistress's apartment, bringing down 2 black shirts with him before a rifle but to the back of his skull silenced him forever. Enzo, ever the pragmatist, simply vanished one night, a whisper suggesting he had secured passage to Tunisia, his loyalty ultimately superseded by the primal instinct for survival. The intricate web of the family was being torn apart, strand by strand, and at its center, Don Lucio remained, a spider watching his creation being systematically destroyed. I stayed with him. Where would I go? The scar on my face was a brand that tied me to him as surely as any chain. I was now his sole attendant, his last remaining confidant, a young man of 20 living in the echoing silence of a villa that was too large, too empty. The ledgers I had so painstakingly learned were now useless, records of our economy that no longer existed. The stream of supplicants and subordinates had dried up, replaced by the occasional, furtive visit from a broken man bringing news of another arrest, another business seized, another friend lost. Don Lucio aged a decade in a year. The immaculate suits began to hang a little looser on his frame. The carefully trimmed mustache showed more salt than pepper. But his eyes, though weary, never lost their core of defiant pride. He would sit for hours in his study, the shutters partially closed, a single glass of untouched Amaro on the desk before him, staring at the wall as if he could see the ghost of his former power projected there. The few who remained, the last loyalists, urged him to flee. They had contacts, they said. A fishing boat could be arranged from a cove near Cefalu. He could be in Tunis in 2 days, from there to Argentina or America. He could rebuild. He listened to these pleas with polite indifference, a faint, sad smile playing on his lips. "This is my home," he would say, his voice quiet but firm. "My father is buried here." His father? I will not be run off my own land by a buffoni from Predapio. It was not stubbornness, I realized. It was a final, profound act of defiance. To flee would be to acknowledge that their new, loud, brutal world was more real than his quiet, ancient one. To stand his ground was to assert the permanence of his authority, even in the face of its annihilation. The end, when it came, was almost an anticlimax. It was a gray, drizzly morning, the kind of weather that was rare for Palermo, making the city feel like a sad, forgotten place. There was no dramatic kick at the door. A single, black, official car pulled up outside the villa. A man in a crisp, dark uniform, not a black shirt but a high-ranking officer of the new state police, stepped out, accompanied by 2 others. They knocked, a firm, polite, terrifying rap on the wood. I answered. The officer looked past me into the dim hall. "We are here for Don Lucio Luciano," he said, his Italian accent clean and northern, devoid of the musicality of our dialect. Don Lucio was waiting for them in his study. He had dressed with particular care that morning, I realized. His best suit, his shoes polished to a high shine. He stood behind his desk, not as a defendant, but as a host receiving unwelcome guests. He did not speak as they entered. The officer read from a document, a list of charges, association, extortion, conspiracy, words that sounded hollow and insignificant in that room, unable to capture the complexity of the man or the world he had ruled. Don Lucio listened, his head held high, his hands resting lightly on the desk. When the officer finished, there was a long silence. Then, Don Lucio gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. He looked at me, and his eyes held a message that was meant for me alone. It was not a message of fear or of regret. It was a message of continuity. It said, "You see? This is how it is done. You meet your fate with silence. You do not give them the satisfaction of a struggle." He turned back to the officer and gave a single, slow nod. He came out from behind the desk, surrendering not a single inch of his dignity. He walked towards them, and as he passed me, he paused for the briefest moment. His hand, the clean, well-manicured hand that had signed death warrants and bestowed blessings, reached out and rested on my scarred cheek. It was a touch of startling tenderness, a final, silent blessing. A transfer of something sacred. Then he walked out the door, between the two officers, and into the gray morning without a backward glance. I stood in the sudden, profound silence of the villa. The machine of his power, the network of loyalties and fears, the very essence of the family, had shattered the moment he crossed that threshold. The head had been cleanly removed. What was left was not a body, but scattered, terrified cells. I was alone. The purpose that had defined my every waking moment for the better part of a decade was gone. The fortress was empty, its king taken, its walls meaningless. The only thing that remained was the cold, permanent ache in my face, a phantom pain for a world that had just ceased to exist. The world did not end with Don Lucio's arrest. It simply became a paler, quieter, and infinitely less significant place. He was tried in a court in Rome, a spectacle designed to showcase the triumph of the modern state over the archaic forces of darkness. They found him guilty, of course, and buried him in a prison on a barren island off the coast, a place where the sun was a punishment and the sea wind a constant, mournful whistle. The family, as we had known it, was finished. Not with a war, not with a glorious last stand, but with the slow, bureaucratic grinding of the state's machinery. Some men were imprisoned alongside him. Others, like me, were too small, too insignificant to be worth the cost of a trial. We were the ghosts left behind, haunting the ruins of a kingdom that no one else could even see anymore. I returned to my mother, but I was a stranger in her house, a man-shaped void filled with secrets that would have terrified her. The scar on my face was my only history, and it was one I could not share. I drifted through the years that followed, through the war that came and went, a conflict that felt like someone else's story superimposed over our own. The fascists fell, the Americans came, and a new, different Italy struggled to be born, an Italy of loud machines and forgetting. I used the last of the money I had saved from my time with the family, a small, heavy pouch of gold coins Don Lucio had given me for a time of need, to buy this place. This bar without a name. It was not an ambition, but a refuge. A place to wait. The walls were already stained with smoke, the floor already warped by time. It suited me. I became a curator of silence, a keeper of the empty hours. The few men who still find their way here are like me, old, haunted, their eyes holding the same distant look of men who remember a different gravity, a different weight to the air. We rarely speak of it. There is no need. We recognize each other by the way we hold a glass, by the way we listen to the silence. We are a dying breed, and this bar is our leper colony. The new world bustles outside, a world of chattering televisions and buzzing scooters, a world that believes in progress and the future. They dig up our ancient cobblestones to lay down pipes for modern comforts. They look at a man like me and see only an old man, a relic, a piece of street furniture as worn and anonymous as the stone fountain in the piazza. They do not see the king's shadow that I once was. They do not understand the language of a slow nod, the economy of a respectful silence. A young man will come in, as they sometimes do, his clothes too bright, his voice too loud, and he will ask about the scar. He will see it as a flaw, an imperfection, a story of a knife fight or a war wound. He cannot comprehend that it is a text, the first and last page of a Bible written in a dead language. He cannot understand that it represents a world where a man's word was his bond, and his silence was his shield, and his loyalty was a currency more valuable than life itself. And so I sit. The fly buzzes. The tap drips. The light fades. The scar on my face, this ugly, beautiful, terrible scar, no longer aches with the cold or the damp. Now it aches with memory. It is a phantom limb for a phantom life. It throbs with the image of Don Lucio's calm eyes, with the smell of Toscano cigars in a back room, with the terrifying, exhilarating weight of a cream-colored envelope. It is the ghost of Franco's nod, the echo of Vito's boast, the final, tender touch of Adon's hand. I am the last witness. When I am gone, the true memory of that world will be gone with me. All that will remain will be the caricatures in the newspapers, the sensationalized stories, the loud, clumsy lies. They will never know the sacred quiet. They will never understand the price of a whisper. I pour myself a glass of Amaro, the dark, bitter liquid, a taste from that other time. I raise it in a silent toast to the ghosts. To Don Lucio. To Franco. To Enzo. To the boy I was, who believed in the fortress of the family. The liquid burns on its way down, a familiar, comforting pain. Outside, a scooter backfires, and a young man laughs, a sound devoid of history or fear. I look around the empty bar, at the dust motes dancing in the final, slanted light of the afternoon. I am a ghost. The scar is my chains. And this story, the only one I will ever tell, is my prison and my kingdom. It is over. It will never be over. The whisper, in the end, was the only thing that survived. And I am its final, fading echo.